It's now my privilege to introduce Rhoda Morey, who will be moderating the first session. The session's entitled Curating Through a Different Lens, Biocultural Collections and Traditional Knowledge. Rhoda is the manager of plant growth facilities and the arthropod quarantine facility at Cornell University's School of Integrated Plant Medicine, and was recently the director of horticulture at Cornell Botanic Gardens, at Cornell University. I also just wanted to note that you'll probably notice a big display of cucurbitaceae and arachnids. So we have a big Halloween event going on right now. It doesn't normally look like this. Giant pumpkins. Okay, so welcome, Rhoda.
So I imagine that some of you are asking why this session here at the APGA Collections Symposium. And I've been diving into this question of what a social role public gardens might have in the context of current socioeconomic and biological context since my graduate work at UMass Boston. And the images that I'm going to show you, if this works properly, are going to give you some overview of my context and my own journey while I'm giving this kind of long introduction to our speakers today. I've had a rather traditional career in public horticulture, both on the east and west coasts of the United States, but my seed of wonder for plants and appreciation for cultural diversity was really planted on the summer road trips that my parents took their children on. And no doubt my young curiosity and excitement for difference brought me to anthropology and horticulture as my undergraduate work. These became places where I could really start to name and make sense of how plants were related to each other and how different worldviews and relationships to nature brought beauty to our shared humanity. Through my work and community of friends following my formal education, I became intimately aware that there are other valid ways of thinking about relationships to land, to people, and all living beings. And I embarked on the career many of you know me for as a plants woman, designer, plant recorder, curator, and photographer. But the elite and colonial history of horticulture in relationship to a new social purpose for botanic gardens is troubling me. And I want to do something to help bring different voices and practices into the world that honor more sustainable and ethical ways of knowing and practicing those relationships. My first opportunity to practice this was within collections management at Cornell Botanic Gardens, where I crafted a collections policy that opens opportunity for community-curated biocultural collections and addressed ethical and diversity issues for acquisitions. I also continue to teach and engage with communities of collaborative learning practice in the Science in a Changing World program at UMass Boston. When I was promoted within Cornell of July this year to manage those research greenhouse facilities and growth chambers and that arthropod quarantine facility that Cynthia mentioned, the policy was not yet adopted by the Gardens Advisory Committee, but I suspect we'll probably go through another revision with a new director of horticulture before the garden has strategy to really support the policy. But 8 years ago, I started thinking about collections beyond their taxonomy and in the context of climate change, which is really one biocultural story that's affecting our global community. But I'm also thinking beyond our collections in the eyes of Western beauty, science, use, and knowledge. Some gardens have culinary or medicinal collections with really amazing interpretation strategy, and some gardens tell the stories of arts and humanities from cultures around the world. But I'm asking the question if curating our collections in our traditional ways is enough, if we're really going to start thinking about our collections as biocultural collections. I'm asking the question if diverse worldview representation in our interpretation programs should extend into our collections management strategies as really living in practice with what we say we are doing. I'm not dismissing value that Western culture can offer, but I'm suggesting that we have an opportunity to give voice to the breadth of knowledge within the human experience. So later, I'm happy to talk more about the specifics of the policy if any of you are interested, But today, I'm really happy to help make space for other voices that help open an exploration of what curating biocultural collections might mean at your own institutions with the help of 4 perspectives on ethics, relationships, and practice. Nancy will be speaking first today, and she has been with the University of Victoria since completing her PhD with Roy Taylor at the UBC when he was director back in the 1970s or so. She emphasized in her autobiographical introduction during some of our planning sessions the importance of language being part of the story of biocultural diversity preservation. And she shared the current challenge of the forest fires in British Columbia, which are the 3rd worst in recent history, and how the fire is heightening conservation about saving and restoring culturally relevant plants. Nancy is one of the most respected ethnobotanists in the world, specializing in ethno-ecological studies with Western Canadian Indigenous peoples, particularly here in British Columbia. The University of Victoria is deeply immersed in the life of communities around the world with civic engagement as a key part of their mission. She began collaborating with First Nations peoples more than 45 years ago to document and promote their traditional knowledge of plants, including foods, materials, and medicines. Her research and teaching about the relationship between Indigenous peoples and plants and how those relationships influence the landscapes and habitats of Western Canada really helped establish the University of Victoria as a national and international leader of ethnoecology and traditional knowledge studies. She inspires me to think about peoples in place, or peoples in nature, and ways that it might create spaces of learning around this much needed worldview. When I first met Pepela, I was gently reminded during a lively discourse among our panelists how important her voice as an Indigenous woman represents a valuable perspective on the ethics of intellectual property rights. She is the current president of the International Society for Ethnobiology, whose mission is to, quote, understand and strengthen relationships between human societies and the natural world, and to promote biological, cultural, and linguistic diversity. In particular, they support the vital role of Indigenous, local, and traditional peoples in protecting their ecosystems and knowledge base, and provide platforms for discussions among these groups and other people involved in the stewardship of resources. Central to their mission is creating a space for dialogue, cooperation, and action across diverse languages, cultures, and worldviews. She has worked for her community as the director of an Indigenous research group consisting of ethnobiological interests, water and tidal rights, and cultural sacred landscapes and archaeology. And she has been a member and project facilitator of various boards of directors for local Indigenous organizations, providing mental and spiritual counseling for victims of the residential schools and subsequent settlement agreement. I am inspired by her spirited and very thoughtful voice for Indigenous peoples at the table of influence around the world on such issues as climate change, pharmaceutical ethics, academic thesis defense processes, and ethics of Indigenous knowledge, rights, and relationships. Then we'll have Sadafumi, or Sada Uchiyama. He is the garden curator at the Portland Japanese Garden and a practicing registered landscape architect. He's also a 4th-generation gardener from southern Japan, where his family has been involved in gardening for over a century. At the age of 8, he studied with his grandfather, father, and uncles in Japan, as the craft is not taught in schools or universities. But at the age of 18, rather than join the profession, he left Japan to see the world. He worked on planning and reforestation projects in places such as Yemen, Saudi Arabia, and Tanzania, where he learned how much he did not know and became aware of the landscape architecture profession. In 1988, he came to the United States, earned a BLA and an MLA at the University of Illinois Champaign-Urbana, came to value his family tradition and became a, he says, new student of Japanese gardening and staying in the U.S. From then on. 7 years later, he joined the Portland Japanese Garden and, in essence, returned to his roots. He is devoted to fostering relationships between Japanese gardens in Japan and those outside of Japan through his founding work with the International Association of Japanese Gardens, the North American Japanese Garden Association, and the Hand and Heart program at the Portland Japanese Garden. The Hand and Heart program is an intensive hands-on training course that creates transparency of skills and approaches to gardening that lie inside Japanese garden masters' heads. Sada believes that Japanese gardening know-how can be taught, and what cannot, he says, quote, the body learns through experience. He is aware of the challenges and complexity of his program, and other attempts to teach this art have failed owing to cultural differences, he says. But he plans to be slow, deliberate, and careful about the program, much in line with the craft of Japanese gardening. He is excited to be part of this panel, as he still considers himself new to the field of biocultural diversity and how it may be relevant to the work he does as curator at the Portland Japanese Garden. He's interested in exploring the meaning of what he does relevant to the time we live in, and growing the value and practice of Japanese gardening beyond the arts and crafts image it has to many Western eyes, to reveal the depth of its aspect as a healing place. And then Michael Demota has served as the head curator for living collections for the National Tropical Botanical Garden since the latter part of the 2006 or so. He previously served as horticulturist and then manager of living collection. And Mike was born and raised in Honolulu and attended the University of Hawaii. His interest in horticulture was inherited from his family, and he began growing orchids and ferns at the age of 12. His exposure in school to Hawaiian studies and the art of hula led to a keen interest in native Hawaiian plants, which he began growing in earnest in about 1997. And during this time, he developed many of his own techniques to germinate plants from seeds and cuttings, which were otherwise difficult to grow. In addition to curating the collections for all of the National Tropical Botanical Gardens and preserves, and overseeing plant records, Mike is responsible for other activities in the Conservation and Horticulture Center, including plant production. He has a long history of volunteering in Hawaii in the field of plant conservation, and even though he now works in public horticulture, his background started really in native plants, especially those with federal restrictions and protections. He has practiced what he calls extreme botany, where propagation of rare and endangered plants practiced by field botanists starts with pollen collections and then works through the entire process of bringing those plants into ex situ collections and restoration sites. He's focused his work as curator of living collections on ethnobotanical collections for the last 10 years from two world views. First, from the traditional Western lens of botanical gardens, and second, from the living culture of Hawaii. He also shared that he has, for years, struggled with the idea of collections, since they imply ownership by an organization or a curator. Instead, collections in Hawaii must consider stewardship for the group, and in his particular environment, conservation for Hawaiian culture. Therefore, the National Tropical Botanical Garden has focused their strategic plan on the acquisition and curation of Hawaiian cultivars without commercial value. The garden sees themselves focusing on the cultural value of collection and as being a repository for making these non-commercial plants available to the people of Hawaii. So I've taken quite a bit of time to share these longer introductions, really to help place some context of each presenter's experience in relationship to our topic today. Their diverse stories will not prescribe take-home curation strategies for you, but they will bring up questions and tensions that might be an opening for exploring how you might think about curation differently in the unique contexts of your collections and institutions. This is purposeful because to prescribe practices or strategies is reinforcing colonial power dynamics. And just as we formed the focus and participation in our session through a collaborative process, you will need to build your own communities of engagement in your workplaces.
Good morning, everyone. It's bright and early. It's great to see all of you. And thanks. It's a real privilege to be here as part of this amazing panel. And Rhoda, thank you for the introductions. It was wonderful to hear about my friends and colleagues here, and I really appreciate your words and your photography. What an amazing photographer she is. I had no idea. I just want to correct one thing. I was only had a long gap between when I got my PhD, and I actually took a paying job. In 1990, I started it full-time at UVic in 91, raised 3 daughters in between, so, but that's not a big deal. Tell them that. Let's see. How do I get this starry thing? Ah, there we are. It's probably a little bit hard for you in the back here to see, but I would be happy to share this with anyone if you want. I have a reduced file version PDF I could just email. So if you're really interested in the slides and you can't see them, just email me, nturner@uvic.ca, and I'd be happy to send it to you. So I also want to acknowledge with respect the Musqueam, Tsewatooth, and Squamish nations on whose lands we live our lives here in Vancouver, and just like everyone to think about what this landscape was like thousands of years ago, and there were thriving communities of people here who tended and looked after these lands and the plants that were growing here. And it really gives a different perspective of the city when you kind of project back in time and realize the close connections that people have always had with this landscape. And of course, I want to thank all of you for being here, and Pam and Cynthia, Rhoda, and my fellow panelists. It's a real privilege to be here with you. So, more than just pretty plants, botanical gardens are an amazing opportunity, I think, to explore not just the plants themselves, but their ecological relationships, their role in the ecosystem, and also their many cultural roles. And botanical gardens provide a forum for hands-on experiential education. We get to understand the historical relevance of plants, the ways that they're used in practical ways, like as food, materials, medicines, but also some of the spiritual and less tangible relationships that we humans have developed with the plant world. And when they're directly here in front of us and available for people to see and feel and smell and so forth, that helps all of us to build relationships with our environment. And it's also a way of reconnecting people with the plant world, and to recognize and honor the very knowledgeable people all over the world who have developed these strong, very close connections with plants. And I especially want to acknowledge Clan Chief Adam Dick, Quaxistala Wahla. He passed away in July 30th of this summer. And he was a very dear friend and a teacher for not only myself, but many, many of our students. He never went to residential school. He was kept away by his family up in the Kingcome Valley when the police came to take the children to residential school. And so he grew up not knowing how to read or write English, but just an amazing knowledge holder who had experience with his grandfather and grandmother and the other elders of his day. He died, he was about 89 when he died. And so you can imagine the life that he led, building canoes with his grandfather and learning about the foods and the medicines and the tequilak, the root gardens down in the estuary of the Kingcome River. So to me, he symbolizes someone who has a deep relationship with the plant world and also is a gifted teacher and is committed to making sure that that knowledge gets passed forward to the next generations. And so I think it's really important for all of us, wherever we are, wherever our gardens are in the world, that we recognize and acknowledge the people who have those direct relationships with the plants that are growing in the garden, even if they came from far away, but knowing the indigenous peoples who are living in those places and using those plants for thousands of years. It's so important to recognize that. And there's my friend Dr. Mary Thomas from the Secwepemc Nation. She was another amazing knowledge holder who knew about medicines and so much else, and I just wanted to recognize her. We have a policy for reconciliation with Indigenous peoples as part of the Canadian government's commitment. And to me, this recognizing and acknowledging this kind of knowledge is an important part that's often under-recognized in the process of reconciliation. But I'll let Verna talk more about that, I think. There's so much knowledge that's held by people that is not necessarily available to even botanists who study these plants in an academic setting. And so recognizing the diversity of the different kinds of plants is important. And for both, say, Saskatoon or Sarvitsberry, Amelanchier elnifolia, for the native crabapple here, Malus fusca, for the First Nations who use those, they recognize many different varieties, more than botanists recognize, nomenclaturally anyway. And so having that knowledge as part of the collections themselves is really important. This is Aina National Park, and I was there many years ago. It's near Osaka in Japan, and they have some wonderful living collections of plants that are culturally important for Japan. And also they practice some of the traditional methods like the untilled rice growing, so that keeps some of those traditions alive in what they're doing, preserving rare and endangered plants as well. So there are many examples of gardens around North America and the world where people are actually doing a lot of these things that I'm talking about. The Montreal Botanical Garden, for example, has a wonderful exhibit of the Three Sisters planting method for the Mohawk and other Six Nations people, and traditional plants growing there, and an ethnobotanical walk that you can take. Even in Italy, the Padua Botanical Garden, one of the oldest in the world, has exhibits about human relationships and uses of plants. And many of these botanical gardens also embrace trails where you can walk through and you can focus on the human-plant relationships that exist in a given area. It's also, botanical gardens are places where you can undertake relearning through doing of some of the traditional methods of propagating and maintaining plants, like Fritillaria kamchatensis, for example, the northern rice root, which Indigenous people eat. And some botanists would be horrified to think that people are eating that plant, but in fact, the actual cultivation and the digging and the spreading of the propagules, the little bulblets and the sprouts on the bulb, actually increases and enhances their growth. So they almost have to have some kind of disturbance, whether it's from grizzly bears or from humans, to actually propagate them and spread them around. And that's the way with a lot of the indigenous plant foods. And of course, when we first talked about biocultural collections, I thought museum collections and herbaria. I wasn't thinking of botanical gardens and living plant collections, but of course they're part of it. But linking the botanical gardens to the museum collections and the many objects that are created from plant materials is a really important thing as well. And I put this picture in. It's photo of a collection that I made in 1972 for the UBC Botanical Garden, and it's one of the many varieties of Saskatoon berries that I collected up in Hatlip, north of Lillooet. And I collected not only herbarium samples, it was part of my doctoral research, but I collected living samples of these different Saskatoons that were planted out in the botanical garden. I don't know if they're still growing there, but there's at least a little bit of documentation of the deep and rich knowledge that was held by the elders of that area, especially Sam Mitchell. And you can see the names at the bottom. I won't, Chakum is just the general name for Saskatoon, but then there's Spukpuk, means white. It's one of the little varieties with white hairs at the tip and very few seeds, and makes a lot of juice, and it's good for marinating things. Each kind of variety had its own characteristics, and documenting that as part of the botanical garden experience, I think, is important. There is Sam Mitchell, the one who knew all about those Saskatoon varieties, making rope from rope willow. So another, I think, function for botanical gardens is actually to link with local communities and to provide the materials that they need that have often been extirpated or at least reduced in the areas where they used to grow by some kind of industrial development. So botanical gardens can provide a service for local people to get some of the foods and medicines and materials that they've used in the past that are no longer easily accessible. I could talk for a long time about that, but I have to stop soon. So thank you very much, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your time here. Thank you. I'm very happy to introduce Pepela. You're speaking next, right? Yes, and we've known each other for a long time. She's a dear friend from the Ntlaka'pamux Nation, and I had the fortune of having her in one of my classes, and it's questionable about who taught who more. You can imagine. I learned a lot from her.
The reason I push that away is my traditional name is Pipepa, which means frog. Big mouth in a little pond. So I'm sure you can all hear me quite well, right? Yeah, I figured. Over there? You hear me okay? Good. That's how we'll start this. It is incumbent upon me, as an Indigenous person, to acknowledge the homelands of some of the Coast Salish people, the Tsaleil-Waututh, the Musqueam, and the Squamish peoples. I would also like to acknowledge Rhoda, Pam, Cynthia, where are you, Cynthia? Way back there. Seda, Mike, the UBC and Van Dusen Gardens, and most particularly my good friend and mentor, Nancy Turner. Thank you all, and thank you for joining us today. Nancy is right. She was my mentor at the age of 40-something. I can't remember. It's been so long ago. I don't know whether it was wisdom or not. I decided to go to university at that ripe old age. My family had grown up. They left home. And I thought, why not? Boy, did I struggle. I don't have the head for academics. But I persisted. I'm pretty stubborn, so I knew I would get through it somehow. By hell or high water, I didn't know, but I knew I would be able to do it. I come from the Ntlaka'pamux Nation, which is in the interior of British Columbia. I was raised traditionally by my paternal grandparents until I was sent away to a residential school in British Columbia. Now, we're going to be discussing today a lot of these relationships between traditional communities and yourselves, Indigenous people and yourselves. What I want you to understand is never, ever underestimate the intelligence of the Indigenous and traditional communities. It may not be in context of your intelligence, but there's a lot of intelligence out there that you have yet to tap, if that is your goal. Even though I did struggle in my academic life, I hold a Bachelor of Arts degree with a double major in geography. Why I chose geography, I don't know. I hated it. But it was a way to get into environmental studies. And this came from the University of Victoria. Much later, in my 60s, and that was a long time ago, I earned a Master of Education from Thompson Rivers University, and the title of my capstone paper was Indigenous Traditional Teaching and Learning Methods in a Culturally Relevant Context, subtitled The Braided Theory. It is yet to be published. I'm still backing and forthing, but I did finish it. I just wanted to correct one thing. I am the past president of the International Society of Ethnobiology, probably only the second or third Indigenous person to take that position. I have to apologize, I didn't have any nice pictures to bring from that. I'm in the midst of a move. We had just finished harvesting our traditional foods, fishing, etc., and that was where my focus was. So I apologize if I'm all over the map today. I'll try to stay the task though. So the beginning of my relationship with the ISC started in 2006, and this came from a good friend of mine by the name of Dr. Kelly Bannister from UVic. I met her at one of the North American, or is it SOI? SOE conferences. And she invited me to Chiang Rai, Thailand, to be part of an international Indigenous group to amend and update the Code of Ethics for the ISE from an Indigenous perspective. Wow. Imagine Indigenous people being part of developing the Code of Ethics that affects them the most. And the reason for this exercise was to level the playing field and even the balance of power between academics, researchers, students, lawyers, policymakers, and community leaders that work alongside the Indigenous peoples and traditional communities. From the Indigenous perspective, this was to protect intellectual knowledge and property rights against those who would copyright the information. And this was also within the language in context of culture as opposed to understanding the collaborator point of view, worldview, sorry. I can tell you from my own personal experience that the relationship between the Academy and the Indigenous collaborators, notice I word collaborators because I hate the word informant. It makes me feel like a criminal against my own people, so I despise that word. This relationship has not always been stellar, especially due to the fact that the Academy has a policy of publish or perish. You remember those days? You still doing it? My sympathies. The reason I'm challenging that is because it's important to build relationships, isn't it? And oftentimes when you're under the gun of the publish and perish, you don't get to form those important relationships. I'm going to give you an example of how copyright infringes on my people. There was a dictionary that was developed of our language many years ago. We cannot make any changes, acknowledge new information, make additions, or make copies for our use from our dictionary due to copyright. We're trying to mitigate that. We're dealing with a person who is one of the authors. She wants us to have it, but there's always some hold up in the legal battle somewhere. In my mind, it's like being held prisoner to keep me from furthering the development of my own language. And this hurts because I am not a fluent speaker. I grew up speaking the language until I was about 5 or 6 years old, until I was sent away to school. And I'm sure you're all aware that when you came to the school speaking a language, they beat the bejesus out of you to get it out of you. The most important topic of discussion during the Code of Ethics exercise was the difference in understanding information in context of language, culture, and social structures. We have been set upon by a colonial system that has no flexibility for the understanding of developing long-term relationships with the collaborators. Those of us who are collaborators have detected the lack of respect and patience in some cases. There has also been a lack of meaningful compensation, whatever that might mean. That would depend on the community, or mostly community that we work with. I advise you not to work with individuals unless they are the top of their field. We had something happen in our community where a couple of people had gone to one person and asked them about our rock paintings, where they were, and actually put these on a map with a longitude, latitude, and the rest of us just went up in arms. And they said, well, we asked somebody. Well, they may know that knowledge, but that they talk to other people. It is our tradition to discuss these things before they go out into the public realm. Now we find that some of those rock paintings have been destroyed. They've been, people with their fancy paints go and paint over them. So it's really important to us to have those meaningful relationships as well as the meaningful compensation that goes with it. Now by this I mean something that is tangible, meaningful compensation, and much needed in the community of study. And there are many examples of what that would look like. Personally, I hate getting money. I'd rather have something happen to enhance our community's ability to maybe get school supplies for the children, things like that. There's many different ideas. This is just a very simple idea. Now, developing those long-term relationships is critical if you want the cooperation needed for good, comprehensive research. I would like to think that the days of the hidden researcher are a thing of the past. And I'm going to tell you a story about my father and how this affected him. It was a long time ago. But when he was still alive, he had a reputation for capturing and taming wild horses, or mustangs, because we have a lot of them in our area. Some research, and I don't know where the origins of this was, but some researcher had made arrangements to interview him and set a time and a date without any input from my father. Dad, being the perceptive person he was, started wondering, how was this going to happen without getting to know me first? The individual arrived and without any protocols proceeded to question my father. This was not how we operated. And so, as Dad put it, he said, I lied through my teeth. Told him what I thought he wanted to know with wild embellishments and sent him on his way. My father never heard from him again, but was not a bit concerned. To date, there has never been any evidence that this interview took place. Now, this is going to be the puncher. Of course, my father was a great storyteller, too. If you give this dubious illustration I give you this dubious illustration as a cautionary when dealing with collaborators. Get to know them very closely and understand their protocols, worldviews, etc. I know this is going to be a challenge when you are under the publish-or-perish gun. But you know what? It's time to challenge the academy. And I'm sorry for the older men in the audience, but challenge those old buggers. You can't rule everything all the time. Things have to change. It's a changing world. We're in an age of reconciliation between Indigenous people and the rest of you. Now, going into the origins of the International Society of Ethnobiology. I don't know how many people here have heard of Taro. You have. Anybody else? I have. Of course you have. All right. This is where it all started. In 1988, 30 years ago, the ISE was initiated out of the Declaration of Belém. Remember when they had that big conference down in Belém? And with the leadership of Dr. Darrell Posey from Oxford University in England, even though he was from Missouri, Dr. Posey was an entomologist that morphed his work into a broader scope as he worked with his collaborators in the Amazon. This is Botany. He came to understand, I think, that his research was too focused on one topic, and as he made observations of the Indigenous people and their interaction and intimacy with the world they lived in. He began to understand that their world was much more complex and had been ignored in conventional science. To illustrate this, I'm going to try to recall a story that he told in one of his papers, and to emphasize how one worldview differs from another and why understanding is critical for a differing worldview. And I'm really, kind of trying to tell you this story and remember what I read about it. It was a story about him. He was staying in a village with some indigenous people of the Amazon. And the leader of the village said to him, "We're going hunting, and you want to come along?" So he went along with them, and they killed a tapir. Those great big rodents, I think they're rodents, because they were looking for some meat. So they bring it home, they butcher it, they get it all set up, and they have this huge cauldron. They put the tapir meat in it and covered it with this brackish-looking water. And they said to him, "Now we have to go into the next village and do some business. Would you stay here and look after it?" He says, "Sure." He says, "I got work to do." He says, and the leader says to him, "No, in about 5 days I want you to check up on it and see how it's doing." Not explaining what it was he was supposed to be looking for. So off they go. Dr. Posey gets busy, gets to work, does his thing, and about 5 days later he goes and he checks on this. And he looks at it and he says, "Oh my goodness, it's full of maggots." He proceeds to pick it up and pitch it all out the door. So another group of the villagers is walking by, and they look at him and they look at this meat. "You don't want this meat?" "No," he said, it's all gone bad." So they're smiling at each other, they pick up the meat, and away they go, and he's looking at them like, "Are they crazy? This meat's rotten." About 2 days later, the leader and the party come back from doing their business, and they ask him, "Well, how's the meat?" And he says, "Well, I threw it out." And the leader got so upset with him. He said, "Why did you throw it out? That was good." What he didn't know, what Dr. Posey didn't know, is the maggots have a way of tenderizing the meat and making it more edible. He thought it was bad. His comment was, "Why would anybody want to eat rotten meat?" Well, it wasn't rotten meat. It was just that it was being tenderized, and the maggots would have been cooked right out of it. So he learned an important lesson there, is not to take things from his perspective and think it's the only right way. Getting onto this, the ISE was developed as a global collaborative network of individuals and organizations working to preserve vital links between human societies and the natural world. Although we are focused on studies in ethnobiology, there are other disciplines to consider that are combined within: conservation, biocultural diversity, there's your word for the day, as mentioned, intellectual property and resource rights, ecology, applied ethics, and now climate change, and how Indigenous and traditional communities are having to adapt. The major concern first identified by Dr. Posey, and hence the background to the ISE, was that he feared the loss of traditional, local, Indigenous knowledge and the effects of the loss of biological, cultural, linguistic diversity on the world. It's too easy for us living in this cosmopolitan world to give credence to the knowledge keepers of the biological diversity of our world. I think you would agree that climate change is at the forefront of biological concerns at this time in our history. And I would refer you to a book, if you haven't read it already, by Dr. Glenn Ray-Gordetsky. And it is titled The Archipelago of Hope. Write that down, The Archipelago of Hope. Get it, read it. It is an amazing, amazing book. It's become like my second Bible after Council Ethnobotany. Right? It is an amazing work that he's done, and he's traveled all over the world and actually lived with the people and was trying to understand how they were adapting to climate change and how it's affecting their lives on the ground. We that live in these, in our little ivory towers, really don't understand what's going on out there until you have the lived experience. Now to the major part of my presentation, the Icy Code of Ethics. Remember I said it was updated and revised by a group of Indigenous people from around the world, based on our experience. And I'm going to try to summarize what the Icy Code of Ethics reflects in its vision. The issues of ethical decision-making and conduct for ethnobiological research and related activities, and how to facilitate ethical conduct and equal partnering relationships. I refer back to the commitment of meaningful collaboration and responsible reciprocity by everyone. The Code of Ethics is on the ISE website. If you've never visited, it's their International Society of Ethnobiology. And it has been translated into quite a number of languages, actually. The Code of Ethics speaks to the concept of mindfulness. Mindfulness. Self-evaluation. I'm going to give you a little quote at the end if I remember. Self-evaluation, and how the academy or institution consciously and critically evaluates itself in the understanding, actions, and responsibilities to your collaborators and their respective communities. In the past, researchers have done the research without the consent of their subject communities. The Code of Ethics goes further as it applies to all research collections, databases, publications, images, audio or video recordings or other products of research and related activities undertaken, especially that which concerns collation and use of traditional knowledge or collections of flora, fauna, or other elements of biological heritage found on community lands or Indigenous territories. This is a direct quote from our Code of Ethics, which can be found again on the website. I strongly encourage you to visit this. In fact, a lot of other institutions are starting to take note and are using this Code of Ethics. There are 17 principles, 12 practical guidelines, and a glossary of terms, so there's lots to look at. The principles and practical guidelines are based on the concept of traditional resource rights and compliance of standards set by international laws, policies, and customs. These ethics are intended to support and enable level processes. Level, remember the level playing field? But not override community processes, protocols, and methodologies. Now I'm going to get to something about Indigenous intellectual knowledge, wisdom, and property rights. I'd like to touch on this issue because in 2004, the Government of Canada put out this wonderful document titled Indigenous Traditional Knowledge and Intellectual Property Rights. It's on the website, so please have a look at it. I encourage you to peruse this document. It is not perfect, but it is the government after all. It declares that only recently has the need to protect, preserve, and provide for fair use Now, by whom or for whom, I'm not sure, because I'm not sure who derives the benefit. It's not very clear to me anyway, of Indigenous intellectual knowledge and property rights, or traditional knowledge in this case. Entered the domestic and international debate on intellectual property rights. We all know about the continued licensed or unlicensed use of Indigenous and traditional people's knowledges, icons, etc. The big debate about the Redskins. Did anybody see the T-shirt that said Caucasians on it?
Yeah.
Did you see that? That's pretty funny. You got taken in mask. Anyway. Now this is a very critical issue that the government is reluctant to tackle. There's a document out. But the legal people have yet to find a way. They talk about it in general terms, but they don't really talk about, well, how are we going to protect Indigenous intellectual knowledge, wisdom, and property rights? And it's a toughie. It's a real tough situation because so much of our knowledge has already been compromised. People that, take our knowledge and make products out of it. Make medicines, make all kinds of things without any compensation, meaningful compensation, back to the original holders of that knowledge. It scares the living daylights out of the bureaucrats because they're not sure where to go with this. And yet here we go, we're still out there giving our knowledge away for free. Not that we're money hungry, but gee, we got to survive too in this colonial world. And this colonial world derives its success on money. I hate to say it because I hate that word. So, to add insult to injury and give credence to this reluctance, in 2011 I attended WIPO, World Intellectual Property Organization, in Geneva, to sit on these assembled sessions for a week. To my dismay, only bureaucrats were the negotiators, and our tiny worldwide Indigenous contingent could not make any headway, no matter how hard we tried. I have to tell you how this happened. I walked from my hotel out to the WIPO building. I get there, we're supposed to start at 10. I'm there at 10, nobody shows up till 11. So while I'm wandering around, I go into this big hall and I start seeing Canada, United States, China, and all around the thing. So I go, Canada, there's a seat for me. So I sit there, start coming in, and then I get a tap on my shoulder, and this man who's way younger than my son says, "Ma'am, this is for the contingent from Canada." And I said, "Well, I am from Canada, but are you from Ottawa?" I said, "No, but I'm from Canada." He basically kicked me out of the seat, and he says, "I think you have a seat back there, way in the back of the hall." And this hall is huge. It holds about 500, maybe more people. So I go back there and I'm trying to find a seat, and apparently somebody had taken my name off, put it on the shelf, and sat there. So I was totally lost. But then I met other Indigenous people, and we started talking. We're sitting there, and I'm listening to the presentations made, and they're talking, whatever bureaucrats talk about. And then they have to get up and start talking to each other. So I turned to, can't remember his name. He was from Kelowna anyway, and we were chatting together, and I said, "Well, let's go and talk to the Canadians." He said, "It doesn't do any good, they just ignore." He said, "I've had arguments with them up one side and down the other, and they won't listen." And there was 3 of them, 3 young people, young bureaucrats who had, and you could tell they had no idea of the Indigenous world. And they were there on our behalf. So to me, WIPO is a total waste of time, from my perspective. I don't know, I think it's just a lot of people posturing. That's the impression I got. They're posturing with each other to see who could control who, and I know that the American bureaucrat that was there overwhelmed these 3 Canadian whippersnappers, hardly out of their 3-cornered pants. Does that sound familiar? So, I was just so upset I had to leave. I said, this is just a waste of time and a waste of money on the part of the ISC who sent me there. So, from that perspective, I hope I don't even know if I had time on this or not, but I'm going to finish. I hope there will be more time for discussion later on. So I hope I've given you an idea of what was involved, what it took to develop and update the code, where we were situated, when it took place, why the Indigenous and traditional community perspectives mattered, and how we proceeded with attending or amending the Icy Code of Ethics, in particular by those who are most affected. As Nancy mentioned, we are in the age of reconciliation, whatever that means to you. Senator Murray is holding our feet to the fire, ensuring this does not get shelved, as did the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples. You ever heard of that before, RCAP? Anybody hear of it before? Very few. You know where it is? Sitting on a shelf somewhere in Ottawa. There was never action. But Senator Murray is making sure this happens. This is an opportunity to build those good collaborative relationships with the people that you work with, if in fact you are working with Indigenous people. Develop those relationships, close relationships. Don't let somebody like my father lie to you because you are impatient and you have the publish or perish banner hanging over your head. We had this discussion last night. And it's usually when a woman gets up to make a noise, oh, she's just a bitch, don't talk to her, and they'll set her aside. You women get together and start challenging these old buggers. It's time to put them in their place. They don't rule the world. You're the creative minds. I'm sorry, men, I didn't mean to leave you out. I know there's a good bunch among you. Keep up the good work, all of you. And last but not least, I struggled before I came here because I had no idea what biocultural collections were. I have a better understanding and more respect for what you do. Keep up the good work. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Actually, I am now learning a lot about everything and this, biocultural diversities. And again, first of all, thank you very much for APGA to bring me and be a part of this very fascinating panel. And thank you for Bandus and Botanic Garden for hosting this event. Actually great. And with my distinguished panel friends, and I'm glad we am with you and your views re-expanding my views of the world. Thank you very much. So mine is a little bit different from anyone else, which is interesting, and that's good. And so just a little bit of clarification. I'm the fourth generation, but the fourth generation in Japanese garden world is a really new boy in the neighborhood, really. Because I have a 20th generation friends and 16th and so on and so forth. So 100 years is just kind of getting to know what it is of the business. Also, this is something probably I'd like to share in any presentation is the way I was getting into this business of the gardening is basically in Japan there's a notion that any job or profession takes more than a lifetime to begin with. Therefore, you better hit the ground and run. So in other words, there's a notion of maybe this doesn't fit me or this and that. We just don't have that sort of ideas. So the gardening is right in front of me, so I had to take it. And so that was pretty much it. But of course I rebelled and took 25 years to make a basically full circle back. And so my parents said, I told you. So that was it. So I'm from Portland Japanese Garden, and I'm sure some of you know us, but just a little bit of the facts. We are a 501c3 nonprofit organization our business is just the Japanese garden, that's it. And we started in 1963 in the Portland, Washington Park. So we are 55 years old. And now the garden encompassing 12 acres after 2017 expansion of the original 5.5. So we basically double the size. And we have the visitorship of just about 500,000 today, and with 18,000 members that support us. And we provide over 350 cultural and arts and educational programs annually. And this is something, and sometimes when I talk to my friend, they get surprised. We are not small. We have 120 full-time to just do the Japanese garden business, and supported by over 400 volunteers. So that's just a little bit of background. So the Portland Japanese Garden demonstrates and share not only Japanese aesthetics, but also botanical and horticultural practices, knowledge and wisdom derived from the Japanese garden traditions, and then basically Japanese culture as a whole. This includes preserving and sharing the Japanese view, interpretation of, and attitude toward nature. So when I was reading this Biocultural, there's lots of papers, and I was given, it was my homework was great, and I learned a lot. So I'm not totally irrelevant either. So we're talking about the human and nature. So I'm totally, we are on it. So because of this mission, unlike other the botanic gardens, our goal is to demonstrate and showcasing aesthetic and botanical potentials of each species. So actually, we don't have many species within our gardens, probably just maybe no more than 200. It's very few in 12 acres, if you imagine that. But we have, for example, the pine trees, probably we have about half a dozen different sort of form or shape or functions. So that's where we are thriving for. So again, just like eating a fish, a Japanese tradition is basically you don't throw anything, you just eat everything. So in other words, instead of how many species or how many varieties we have, but we really pay attention to what each species can become, so it can do. So that's where, of course, that's with design and aesthetics that makes the sort of our garden really rich. Because you see, for instance, hemlock is, we have, hundreds of years of hemlock all around our garden, but the 4-foot hedge right around the tea house, it's exactly the same age. So again, it's each species has a great potentials, and oftentimes we just kind of take on one part of the species and just, but they have a lot to offer. So my presentation today is actually, since I talked to all these my colleagues and start thinking about what's the relevancy to what I do every day. And I found, I think, I hope this is something relevant and also of your interest. So first, I want to show some slides of what we look like for those who haven't been to Portland. So we have 5 different sort of distinct style of the Japanese gardens. And within the 5.5 acres, what we call classic gardens. This is a tea garden. And of course, you have to have this, being the Japanese garden. So actually, one of the 2 things I'd like to talk about today is what we call natural garden, which is this. So this garden, again, it's one way to see the Japanese garden as artistic sort of creation. And then now I learned actually other dimension, which is where it came from in terms of the forms and ideas. So this natural garden we call Zoki, and some of you may have seen the book called Niwaki, the red kind of. So there's two sort of categories of trees or plants in Japan traditionally. One is Niwaki. Niwaki is something good and of and for gardening. So that's Niwaki. Everything else we call all bunched together Zoki. So Zoki is something you see in the mountain that's conceivably, probably people think there's not much use as far as a sort of beauty and for the garden use. So there has been sort of distinguished that way. So right around probably 1930 and 40s, and this Zoki actually was taken into the garden, which is totally deviating from traditional Japanese gardening, because this is a sort of no-use trees. And what's behind this story is this is again becoming relevant to the human and nature's, and Satoyama. I'm sure some of you are familiar with Japanese term Satoyama. And so this natural garden is all about the Satoyamas. It's interesting. We've been doing this very unconscious way, but once I started digging into where this sort of notion of the natural garden came from. So right around 1920s, 30s, there was a great sort of industrial revolution, and Japanese economy was booming, and unfortunately that all the way eventually ran into the World War II. And World War II afterward, and there is again great deal of economic growth, and the city expanding. Tokyo population is from 7 to 10 million, and eventually now 14 million. So lots of lands and mountains are flattened, and lands was in a wetland filled, and all more or less gone now. And one part of Tokyo is known as, Tokyo used to be like that up until World War II, actually. There's many parts of Tokyo still was in this form. So there is a type of forest. This is actually cultured or cultivated forest with basically primarily two species of Quercus families, basically deciduous oak trees, for making the charcoals. The charcoals are the primary source of heat in Japan for a long, long time. And up until pretty much the World War II, right around 1950, and the oil becomes more available and the charcoal making is gone. So in order to get the straight, nice size, very fast growing sort of material to make a charcoal, this is the forest basically looks like. Mid-story is basically vacant. You can see the ground covers and the trees. And trees are actually cut from the base probably every 7-8 years. So all trees are primarily multi-stem form. And they go straight up and down very fast. 5-6 years, they can harvest. So probably about 10 years cycle you can cultivate. So this kind of forests are all surrounding Tokyo areas or Kanto region. And because again, the source of energy source changes. So these forests start disappearing. So couple of gardeners recognize the importance of, or this sort of more like an emotional attachment to this forest. They started using these trees actually and into the garden, which was a totally taboo from the traditional gardening, because this is Zoki as opposed to Niwaki. So that there was a big movement on creating this garden, and I think Portland Japanese garden is the only one have this type of gardens, which we thought that just one kind of or a different type of Japanese garden, but as I dig into the history and more, I recognize what it is and what it means. So as my presentation title suggests, basically the garden or gardening I've been doing in a very unconscious way, but actually it's preserving otherwise lost, cultural landscapes. You can see in small parks or some areas preserved forests of this type around Tokyo. But the interesting thing is there are thousands of gardens in this style all over Japan. So now they are actually getting into the public parks. So it's interesting. I'm actually flying to Tokyo tomorrow for a couple other conferences. So this is a great, actually, the new kind of topic to talk about the gardens in this way. So just a little back to so this is how typical Japanese the rural landscape works in terms of sequence from the house, villages into the wild natures. So from the house, and there's rice paddies, and then this managed forest. This is a very typical sequence. And then there's eventually the sort of village shrines or something really demarcates the end of cultivated land. And beyond, basically behind this shrine is a wild nature, which is actually the subject for the worship itself. So it's not the shrine, what's behind the shrine. The shrine is nothing more than demarcation of that space. So the village, when I'm child small, and this is pretty much the sort of playground going through the rice paddies and the deciduous forest, and this is a sort of destination. So that's how. So if some of you might know the Hayao Miyazaki's animist, My Neighbor Totoro, that's exactly that quintessential landscape. So that's the end, the destination is a little shrine that basically oversees the village. So this forest, this is a small part, actually patch, still survives near Tokyo. The ground covers, you can see this is a Kumasasa, basically Sasa ridge, and then the trees standing. But again, this is not the living forest anymore because this is preserved, right? Because no more charcoal making happening. So this is our natural garden in Portland. So you can see the interesting is the only natural garden, and everything, all other type of Japanese garden is very symbolic and sort of in a way miniaturized, as you may know. This is a real scale on real things. So that means tree is what it is. Rocks are what it is. So this doesn't take any symbolism. So what this one does is basically just giving you a space to enjoy. So you can see almost there is no sign of sort of our touch. But this is actually most heavily maintained garden of all of our garden. The reason being that you have to prune in such a way you don't notice it's pruned. So when you have a bunch of branch on the ground, truck roads, and it doesn't look like you did anything, that's the best compliment as far as this garden. So it's very different. Same thing. So you can see really the ground plane, and the middle story is absent, and that's it. And stone is actually no longer a main feature, which is very different from the other Japanese garden style. Almost this one doesn't look like garden, but this is one of the finest, actually, one survived in Tokyo, the private residence. But again, this is designed and maintained garden. And okay, the next thing is, I'm going to go a little quick, is the Japanese tea ceremonies are well known, as you know. So the tea has three components. One is, of course, tea itself, and two is a utensils comes with. And third, can you guess what? Plants. This is the one missing actually hasn't introduced to the outside of Japan yet. Because tea won't compete without tea flowers. Because tea flower mostly comes from the host garden. So that's why it never be sort of subject for the introduction. So utensil and tea and all those tea culture all over the United States and North America, yet no one actually really talk about the chabana, we call the tea flowers. There's about 200 some species, actually native species, mostly annuals and some trees. And actually these are also preserved in the imperial household garden right in the middle of Tokyo. So there's an imperial palace in the middle of Tokyo. If you go there, these flowers are there. And they basically preserve those indigenous species there. And that's actually most appropriate and most probably safest spot to do it. So at Portland Japanese Garden, we're developing this we call Chabana Gardens. The intent is to not just introduce the Japanese species, but find the local and regional counterpart. Thereby, we can use this model for the Chicago, the North Carolina, elsewhere. So that's the intent. So the garden is just under development because this is brand new. So we're able to carve out about half acre the land within this new expansion area. So this is our tea garden. So basically the flower arrangement has also long history in Japan. But the difference of the tea flowers as opposed to the arranged flowers, we call kado, or it's very different. The tea flowers is really, again, mostly the indigenous plants that you can find around your house. And you don't actually arrange. They really avoid the word arrange. You place it, right? So it's a very simple arrangement. And so it changes throughout the season. So the tea is very important. The seasonality is absolutely essential of the tea. So in Japan, same thing. We have spring, summer, fall, and winter, and that's further divided into 24 seasons, and 24, and again divided into 72 seasons. So 72 seasons is almost every 5 days. So the ancient and old Japanese people are very keen to the seasonal change. So they can tell by every 5 days what is in bloom and the type of birds and type of creature comes in and out. So that they made us 72 seasons. Actually still some festivals are based on that seasonality. And so tea flower is pretty much following this tradition. So again, just to bring in the tea flower as it was a set of sort of selected flowers, it comes with a huge bag full of many things. I was stunned to find the one species, the story, just the whole kind of things and regionalities and everything comes with. So we actually, we have events and programs based on that seasonality of these tea flowers. And these are some of the Japanese species we are collecting. And autumn and the winter. So this is our new expansion, just finished in 2017. We have a green roof on top and the tea flower garden is right behind. So we are just at that spot. Okay, thank you and have a bowl of tea.
Okay. Good morning, everybody. Aloha kakahiaka, makimaki o mahalo ia o ko apau no ka hokipa na iau, no kalahu I mua o ki aina nei, me o ko apau loa. Thanking you all for inviting me and welcoming me here, including and especially the First Nations people. I want to start off by showing this. Eo Hawaii, Ho'omaka ia I ka pō. Ai I ka pō ua hānau ia ka honua no ke aloha me ka pilina o papalau o Wakea. Eia nā kanaka, nā ka kuaina o haloa e mālama ia mākou nā pōki'i. So this is sort of the start of the Hawaiian creation chant. And it says, this is Hawaii. It started in the dark or in the night. There in the night was born the land. From getting together of Papa, who is Earth Mother, and Wakea, who is Sky Father. We are the people, and it is our older brother, Haloa, who takes care of the younger siblings. I'll explain a little bit more about that later. Now, there are 132 islands in the Hawaiian chain. These are the 8 main islands which were permanently settled and occupied over 1,000 years ago by a great seafaring people, the Polynesians. There we go, thank you. So our islands were born of fire, and I know that it's been in the news a lot in the last few years, but our islands were born by fire. The volcano goddess Pele is attributed to building land and eating land, so she takes and gives at the same time. Our volcanoes on the island of Hawaii have been erupting since about 1983, and there is a new volcano that will surface in the next 1,000 years or so, just off the coast of the Big Island. So our chain of islands continues to grow. But our islands are also shaped by water. In our location in the north central Pacific, the trade winds blow and our mountains are big. On the Big Island of Hawaii, our volcanoes are over 13,000 feet. And so it catches that trade wind flow. The winds, as they pick up moisture along the way, rise and drop a lot of moisture. Some of our islands get hundreds of inches of rainfall annually. And this is the Wailua Falls on the island of Kauai. Our islands were settled, again, by great seafaring people called the Polynesians. This is a double-hull canoe called the Hokulea, which was sailed in 1976 to Tahiti to prove that it was an oral tradition that big double-hull canoes carried our peoples among the islands of Polynesia. But to prove that it was actually done, this canoe was built and sailed using only celestial navigation to get from the Hawaiian Islands to Tahiti, and it took about 30 days to do so. Now that's what we call an olelo no eau in the bottom left corner, and it says heva'a himoku, which literally means a canoe, an island. And it's a frame of mind that the Polynesians would have had to have learned to be able to survive on a canoe like that. Now, double hull canoes probably ranged up to 100 feet in length and would have been able to carry a lot of people, but they also carried their own supplies. So a canoe and an island, it's the same thing. You have to be able to live on a canoe for a long period of time by not wasting anything. It applies to living even on an island. You have to live within your means and you can't waste anything. So it's an olelo no iao, a wise saying that is becoming more relevant in modern times. Now, to give you an idea, I'm sure you've all seen maps like this of where Polynesia is. Hawaii is the most northern island group in Polynesia. And try and imagine the navigational feat of traveling over the open ocean and finding islands that they did not even know existed. And so they learned as they went along, and their wisdom, they learned to pick up plants along the way. And so they assembled a botanical toolkit that was able to sustain them wherever they went. So again, he va'a he moku, an island, a canoe. You have to be able to live on the means that you're provided. And on a 100-foot double-hull canoe with a lot of people, you learn to extend everything and waste nothing. So I wanted to introduce our garden and the Hawaiian people, not as, I think traditionally most people think Hawaii is the 50th state of the United States, but the Hawaiian Islands were settled, again, by great seafaring people about 1,000 years ago who came up and were self-sustaining until the Westerners found the islands in 1778, and that was Captain Cook. The National Tropical Botanical Garden is a private nonprofit organization that was chartered by the U.S. Congress in 1964, and it started off on the south shore of Kauai. Our first property was purchased with money donated from one of the big sugar companies, and our gardens, we assembled a series of gardens over time. Our mission statement is up there on the upper left-hand corner, and one of the things, the garden started off as primarily a scientific research institute, but the preservation of cultural knowledge became an important aspect. And part of it was because some of the land that that was donated to us contained culturally important ethnobotanical collections, but also culturally important sites. And Limuhuli Garden really was the first big property that was donated to NTBG. It's an entire valley, about 1,300 acres, and there were many archaeological sites throughout the valley. So this kind of gives a chronology of the lands that NTBG acquired over time. And this is where we were spread out. I know the Kampong, we were talking to some of you folks, the Kampong was a property that was owned by David Fairchild, a well-known horticulturalist, and one of our trustees donated it to our organization. Now this is an illustration of an important agricultural and living system that the Hawaiians developed in the time that they settled the islands. We call it the Ahupua'a system. So this is a drawing of Limahuli Valley and how the agricultural system would have been set up throughout the valley. Different parts of the valley were utilized in different ways. And so the plants that the Polynesians, that the Hawaiians brought with them, there were about 24 different plants that they brought as either food, fiber, or medicinal sources, eventually mutated or were bred into different varieties that were ideally adapted to the different locations that they were grown. Limahuli Valley starts, of course, at sea level, and the back of the Ahupua'a, which, by the way, is more or less a wedge-shaped valley on each island. So you have back of the valley, top of the mountain to the end of the coral reef, and from ridge top to ridge top. So a big sort of a pie or wedge shape. And different things were grown or different resources were harvested in different parts of the valley and traded amongst each other under the supervision of a chief in that valley. What you could grow and what you could harvest were determined by what we call the kapu system, which is a religious system that determined what was appropriate to harvest at what time of the month or the year. And looking back on it, it was a real great way to manage your resources because you could never really over-harvest anything because you were only allowed to harvest so much during certain times of the year. So that's the Ahupua'a system, and that's Limahuli Valley, and try and imagine that set up inside of there. So our garden is that cutaway area near the front of the valley where there are still archaeological sites that we have replanted with taro and wetland taro fields, but the terraces go all the way back to the waterfall, which is about 2/3 of the way back in this picture. I mentioned earlier that the Hawaiians the islands were shaped by water, and the Polynesians were guided by their ability to navigate over open ocean. The Hawaiian word for fresh water is vai, and the equivalent translation for the word vai vai, which is like saying water twice, is, I guess the English word would be wealth. You were considered blessed when you had abundant sources of water because taro is the single most important staple food. I mentioned haloa. Haloa is the legendary elder brother of the Hawaiian race, and the first taro plant grew. Haloa was actually a stillborn child, and where he was buried, the first taro plant grew. And in Hawaiian culture, the elder siblings always cared for the younger siblings, so haloa, by becoming a food plant, provides for the younger siblings, and it's sort of the younger siblings' responsibility to farm haloa, to grow, because the plant can't grow and be productive unless it is tended to. So it is the elder-younger sibling relationship that that haloa is really important. Limahuli, as a demonstration of that, we do maintain wetland taro patches here. The Hawaiian wetland taro fields were so productive that by the time Captain Cook arrived in 1778, there were an estimated 1 million people living in the Hawaiian Islands, about 1 million native Hawaiians. And if you've ever seen photos of the Waikiki area where all the hotels are now, it was the breadbasket of the island of Oahu. There were square miles of taro fields and fish ponds all over that part of the island. The other important garden that we sort of inherited is Kahanu Garden, which is in Hana on the island of Maui. That big dark patch there to the right is a Hawaiian temple site. It is called Pi'ilani Hale. Pi'ilani was a legendary chief that united the islands of Maui, Molokai, and Lanai. And it's a huge man-made rock temple site from the top of which you can see, on a good day, you can see all the way to the big island of Hawaii. So when the missionaries began converting the Hawaiians, most of the ancient temple sites and a lot of the old carvings were destroyed. The families that lived on this side of Maui sort of let this go, and the native forest began taking it over, and it disappeared. It went back into hiding, so to speak. And when the family that actually owned this land approached the Botanical Garden back in the 70s, it was to be able to preserve this temple site and the land around it. So it took quite a bit of negotiating, but eventually NTBG took ownership of the property or management of the property, and then our bosses then sort of negotiated with a few Maui families that were known for their rock wall construction. And after a series of archaeological studies from the Bishop Museum, they began to restore this. And so they did it traditionally by building traditional style, what we call oloke, or scaffolding around the entire structure. It's about 4 stories high. So if you ever get to Hana and you're standing at the base of it, it's quite an impressive structure. And the whole thing was fully restored, and it's what we call dry stack. Of course, there's no mortar or anything like that. It's just lava rock fitted and stacked one upon the other for that high. And there's one stone that sticks out of the main part of the wall, and we call it the Pico Stone. Pico is your navel, and the Pico always refers to an important center point for many things. And in the case of this temple site, the Pico Stone, they say if you pull it out, the entire structure would fall apart. So the guy that was actually responsible for restoring this heiau lives in Hana. He's still there, and he still does a lot of that kind of work. Now, this is a list of plants. I know it's hard to read, but this is a list of the plants in the botanical toolkit that the Polynesians travel with and that the Hawaiians brought to these islands when they came. You may recognize a lot of those. You know, we have coconut trees, for example. A lot of people, just take coconuts for granted, but coconuts were not growing in the Hawaiian Islands till the Polynesians brought them. There's a native fan palm in the genus Pritchardia that's very rare now on all of our islands. But coconuts were an important resource because you got sterile water stored in the coconut for years if necessary, and they would have been able to live on that. And every part of a coconut tree has at least 3 uses. So again, food, fiber, or medicinal sources. It was a good thing they brought this too, because very little of the native flora of the Hawaiian Islands was useful for food sources. So they probably would have been able to fish just fine, but everything else would have been hard to. There are no starchy root plants or anything that the Hawaiians could have sustained themselves on. So it was a good thing they brought all of this stuff with them. And so today, the original plants, of course, we have no idea what they look like, but today we have many plants that are the descendants of these original founding plants that are cultivars that was mentioned at our garden. One of our strategic objectives is to try and make a collection of all of the known cultivars, and learning what the cultivars are is part of this process. There are experts, there are elders on all of our islands that they know what the cultivars for Taro, for example, are, and getting them all in our collection is important to us for the future, for sustainability, for with climate change. We're not sure which ones are going to be able to thrive in a different environment, but also because as was mentioned earlier, some varieties, we still use a lot of these plants as food sources, but people living in Honolulu can't farm taro, so they buy all of that stuff. And farmers need to make money, so they will grow the varieties that are highest yielding that they can turn a profit on. But many of these other varieties have religious and cultural significance, and for my part, I feel that it's our gardens, it's because we have the resources and the ability to do it, to put these plants in cultivation, to maintain them for their own uses, for their own purposes, and of course to share them with the communities who are interested in them. Now, we do have cultural practitioners that come into our gardens to harvest and utilize our plants. It is a little bit different. Sort of the modern Western frame of mind to it is, they have a right to the use of these plants, but the traditional Hawaiian frame of mind for that is a word that we use is called kuleana, which is more of a responsibility. So you have kuleana. If you're a fisherman, your kuleana is to the reef. You are allowed to harvest from the reef, but you also have to care for the reef. Hawaiian families in traditional fishing communities actually go out and during the off seasons they will feed the fish. They'll go out and throw traditional food crops that are extra, taro pieces, whatever, and drop them into the water to feed the young fish as they're maturing, so that the next season those fish they can harvest and they maintain the sustainability of that fishery. What's really important, and what I learned as I was growing up is these plants, most of them are vegetatively propagated. So the genetics of these plants and the actual tissues of these plants have been traveling with the Polynesians for the thousands of years that the Polynesians have been going across the Pacific. Bananas are not grown from seed. So the Hawaiian varieties of bananas we have in the islands today travel with the Polynesians going back for thousands of years into Southeast Asia. So there is a real emotional and cultural link to the plants that they depend on. And most of the folks that I know that focus on the Hawaiian ethnobotanical plants have that relationship with their collections and their plants. They feel a real responsibility for maintaining the plants. Now, for example, our big banana collection is at our garden on Maui. There's an introduced viral disease called banana bunchy top virus, and it is not on East Maui at all. So we maintain our banana collection there because we know that the bananas will be safe. Our gardening staff there take their banana collection seriously. They go and check on them every morning. They make sure there are no weevils, there are no other problems with them. And they're all learning how to identify. There are experts, but all of our staff are learning how to identify the different varieties. And some of them are useful as food sources. Usually bananas are eaten green. You boil them and use them like a potato. But some varieties of bananas produce an inner bark that's black that weavers value highly to put color into their weaving, into their mats and other things. So there are different uses for different varieties of bananas. Some are used religiously in the old days. And if there's anybody who's interested in sort of resurrecting some of those uses, the banana varieties are there for that. By the way, you may be interested to know that women were not allowed to eat bananas in the old days. So why that is, I don't know. I have a couple of pictures of different varieties of Hawaiian sugarcane. You know, the sugar industry started in Hawaii using Hawaiian varieties of sugarcane. Sugar was used, the leaves were used for thatching. The stalks themselves, of course, there's that sweet juice, and that was generally used medicinally. And so there are different varieties. There's a picture of one of the varieties that's in that picture was actually used as a love potion. I couldn't tell you which one. Well, I can tell you which one it is, but I don't know if I should. And then sweet potato. Taro is the most important staple food. We're all raised on something called poi, which is the taro corum. It's steamed and then mashed up into sort of a pasty, smooth form. And it's quite bland, but we really don't eat it like that. We let it ferment a little bit, then it becomes very flavorful. And then we eat a lot of fish and shellfish from the ocean, and we eat it together with poi. Poi is very nutritious. But one of the reasons I think that poi, and I have friends from Tahiti and other parts of the South Pacific, that they also make and eat poi, but not as a main staple food. But taro, again, they were traveling with it as a live plant, as suckers or offshoots. If you carry the corm itself, it dries out and will go bad in a couple of days. If you cook it, it gets moldy and goes bad in probably a week. If you change the form and mash it up into poi, it is edible and, of course, retains its nutritional value for weeks, if not months. I've been to rural places in Hawaii where I've taken buckets of very thick poi with very little water added to it, and 4 weeks later, it's still very edible and very tasty. So one can imagine that it is the way when they travel amongst islands more regularly a long time ago, that poi was the thing that sustained them on the long canoe voyages. So that's probably why it became an important staple in the Hawaiian Islands. But in areas where water was not as readily available, sweet potato was a very important staple. And if you looked at the map earlier, the map of Polynesia, all of our canoe plants came from more or less Asia and the Southwest Pacific. Sweet potatoes are native to South America. So I've been trying to read up and get some studies to cite, but it is believed that Polynesians sailed into the Americas and traded a few plants with South Americans and brought back sweet potato. Sweet potato is heavily cultivated in the eastern Polynesian islands. In Hawaii, there are agricultural sites where entire parts of an island, on the big island of Hawaii, for example, where there's very little surface water, huge villages were sustained through sweet potato cultivation at high elevation with no irrigation. It's pretty amazing. Dr. Vitusek did a big study on that. You can look it up online, I'm sure, and you'll learn about that. But there are many varieties of Hawaiian sweet potato as well. They did travel with two kinds of animals. I love the picture of that chicken because he looks really nervous. But they actually came over with three kinds of animals, chickens, dogs, and pigs. And it's a different kind of pig than what's in this picture. But on the Hokulea, to prove that, among other things, that they travel with all of the stuff that they said they did take the chicken and the pig down to Tahiti. And they had to eat them before they got to the Tuamotu Islands because of import regulations and that sort of thing. So. Yeah, no live animals. But again, I go back to Kalo or Taro and it being the elder brother of the Hawaiians. As I mentioned the story, when the first person was born of Papa and Wakea, it was a stillborn child who was wrapped in tapa cloth and buried. When the second child was born, then the taro plant grew out of where the first stillborn child was. And so the word, if you all watch Lilo and Stitch, the word ohana means family, but that is the root word for that is oha, which is the stems of the taro plant. And so it all goes back to that. And every part of this plant is edible. Leaves, the stems, you cook it all, you can eat all. And of course the corm, which you can eat as a potato if you cook it, but which we mash up into poi. If you cut the meristem off and you replant that, so you continually regrow. Ideally, we don't regrow the actual centerpiece, what we call the maku or the parent piece. All the smaller offshoots, the keiki or the children off of that are what we replant because they're younger and they're stronger. The makua piece is a little bit tired. We don't replant that one. This is a variety that's named for a fish. And one of the reasons we think it's really important to maintain as many of the Hawaiian cultivars as possible is because all of the varieties tie into that creation chant that I referred to at the very beginning. If you read the creation chant, there's a bird. Generally, there's a bird, there's a fish, and there's a plant. That's one of our canoe plants that all share the same name. So this plant is called ula ula kumu, and kumu is a very valuable quality red eating fish. Again, the women were not allowed to eat red fish. It was only reserved for the men and only during certain times of the year. This taro variety is actually used in ancient hula ceremonies. When you graduated as a master in hula, in the Hawaiian dance, the kumu variety of taro was part of the ceremony. So I've got a close-up picture of our wetland taro patches, our lo'i from Limahuli Garden. These are taro patch walls that date back nearly 1,000 years. They were reconstructed, but it is where we bring all of our educational groups in there. I just wanted to show, again, the sugarcane variety is a little bit up close. Some of you know kava. We call it ava in Hawaii. It still maintains those uses. The Hawaiians learned to grow agriculturally on phases of the moon. And so every phase of the moon has a different name, and some phases are ideal for fishing, some phases are ideal for planting, and some for harvesting. And then this is a good shot of our garden at Limahuli on the North Shore. Thank you. Mahalo.
So please join me again in thanking all of these wonderful presenters for having a few words with us today.